This video will show you how to install your performance spin power crank on your home spinner bike. All of the instructions that we're going to review today can also be found on spinning.com. The first thing we'll need is the spin power crank. Generally speaking, if you have a crank on your bike that looks somewhat like this, that doesn't have power, this is the crank that replaces it that will have power. We'll also need a 14mm socket wrench. We'll also need a crank removal tool. This is the SPINTech crank removal tool. This 21mm wrench goes with the SPINTech crank removal tool that can be purchased separately, but you need for this bolt on the outside. This is a 15mm wrench for the pedals. The wrench that you received when you purchased your bike will work just fine as well. And also some fitness equipment grease. This is the SPINTech fitness equipment grease that we use for some of the threads for the pedals. Just makes things a little bit nicer. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is to set the bike up in a way that makes it easier to work on. We'll place the pedal in a horizontal way, something like that. And then we tighten up the resistance knob to make sure that that doesn't move. Next, we're going to take off the pedal. This is a little bit different than a normal thread. We're going to actually turn this thread clockwise to take the pedal off. So engage the wrench on the flats of the pedal, hold the pedal, and turn clockwise to remove the pedal. This is the only left-hand thread on the bike, so take a note of it. And there we go. Next, we're going to remove the crank. We'll start by removing the crank bolt. The first thing we do is to take the dust cover off, and you can pry this off with your fingers. Might be a little tricky. Now use your 14mm socket wrench. We're going to turn this counterclockwise like a normal bolt, put it on the crank, hold the crank, and loosen. Might take a few turns to get this bolt out, but once we have it, almost there, you can take the last bit out by hand, and there we go, the bolt is out. Now we'll take off the crank using the crank removal tool. Before we start, make sure that the head of the tool is down flush with the body. So we'll unscrew that until it's completely flush. Now we'll thread this tool into the crank. Make sure it goes in absolutely straight, not to the side, not up or down. Do it by hand until you can feel those threads grab, and it should thread in quite easily. You know the tool is all the way in when there are just a couple of threads exposed, as you see here. When we're ready, we screw the body of the tool in by hand. And now it's time to use the wrench. We'll put the 21mm wrench on here and turn it clockwise to push the plunger in. As you can see, it's moving the crank until you can see it's a little bit loose. We'll now remove the tool. You can feel the crank wiggle here, and there we go. Now it's time to put the new crank on. The first thing we'll do is to take some of this equipment grease and put it on the inside of the crank bolt here. Just coat that surface. You might want to put a little bit here on the bottom bracket. Make sure that it goes on in the same place that you had it before. Give it a little tap. Now take that crank bolt, the one that we used before, and screw it on. We're going to want to tighten this in a clockwise manner, so I've changed the wrench, and we'll tighten it up. We're going to tighten this until it feels really snug. Once finished, we'll go back with a torque wrench and make sure that this is tightened down to 35 to 40 foot-pounds. It's now time to put the left pedal back on the crank. Before we do so, we'll put a little bit of grease on these threads. You can put a little bit inside if you want to, just to make it slick. Start the pedal out by screwing it on by hand. Remember, this pedal tightens in a counterclockwise manner. So we'll screw this on counterclockwise. The grease makes it easier to install. Now we'll put our 15mm wrench and tighten over the top towards the front of the bike. There, it's nice and snug, and we'll give it just a little bit more to make sure that that surface is seated against the crank. The last thing we're going to do is just to clean things up just a bit. Wipe off any excess grease. Put the plastic dust cap back on. And you're ready to go.